My name is Matthew Todd, and welcome to Inside the Scale Up. This is the podcast for founders and executives in tech looking to make an impact and learn from their peers within the tech business. We lift the lid on tech businesses, interviewing leaders and following their journey from startup to scale up and beyond, covering everything from developing product market fit, funding and fundraising models to value proposition structure and growth marketing. We learn from their journey so that you can understand how they really work, the failures, the successes, the lessons along the way, so that you can take their learnings and apply them within your own startup or scale up and join the ever-growing list of high-growth UK SaaS businesses. Hey, welcome back to Inside the Scale Up. Today, really pleased to be joined by Mitch Omer from Trust Keith. Good afternoon as we talk today. Good to have you here.
Good afternoon, Matt. Thank you very much for having me. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, doing well. It feels like September's arrived now as we record this episode, but it's all good.
Thank God. Yeah, I'm done with this hot weather.
No, that's cool. So yeah, as always, I like kind of guests to introduce themselves, tell us a bit about themselves and their business and what it is. So yeah, over to you to tell our audience a little bit about yourselves to kick us off.
I'm Mitchell Omer. I am head of revenue at Trust Keith, which means I look after everything to do with before a company becomes a customer. So anything to do with marketing, sales, and partnerships. That's a short summary of my role.
Awesome. And what is Trust Keith and what does Trust Keith do? What does it provide for people?
Okay, yeah. What's the best way to... I think the best way to explain this is to start off with the problem we solve.
Yeah.
So perhaps I can give you a bit of context first. So as we know, there are tons of tech startups and scale-ups out there today. And naturally, these companies are processing an increasing amount of personal data and generally sensitive data. Because of that, these companies are subject to pressure from all different angles to make sure that that data is protected and secure. So an example might be, 3 examples would be regulatory pressure. So think GDPR compliance.
Yeah.
Another example might be customer pressure. So let's say you're in a B2B SaaS business. In order to work with those big enterprise customers, there are prerequisites that you've got your data security in shape. So they need you to complete due diligence questionnaires, all that stuff. That's customer pressure. And there's also increasingly investor pressure as well. So in order to secure your Series A or Series B round, you need to prove that you've got a good data compliant business. The problem for startups and scale-ups in particular is that a lot of the time they don't have an in-house data protection manager to look after all this stuff. It doesn't quite make sense to have to hire that early.
Yeah.
And so usually what ends up happening is either the founder, a chief operating officer or a chief technical officer will take on responsibility for data protection themselves. Now, why is this a problem? Well, first of all, typically they're not data protection experts. They're quite nuanced topics, and you get people that spend their entire careers doing this stuff. So not experts. Also, these individuals have a ton of stuff to be doing, and they've got dwindling capacity, and throwing data protection on top sometimes is just too much.
Yeah.
And the other thing is they tend to find it a bit boring. Traditionally, it's not the sexiest topic, and you'd rather focus on go-to-market than versus implementing GDPR legislation.
Yeah.
So usually, what ends up happening? Pressure to comply. There's no one in the business to do it, so it ends up being one of those 3. The problem usually then what ends up happening is it either doesn't get done, they don't stay on top of data protection, or they spend a ton of time getting the business data compliant, which means it's a distraction. And so this is the problem we're solving. In terms of how we solve it, it's very simple. We provide a dedicated data protection expert who takes on the technical stuff and the heavy lifting for you to get you compliant. Yeah. And we combine that with a platform where you get access to basically everything you need to become and stay compliant, like policies, procedures, training, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's really good. And I think something definitely relevant to a lot of businesses that I work with, but a lot of businesses in this audience as well, whether you're at the startup or scale up stage.
Yeah.
It's a problem I see, myself time and time again. It's like I say, it's the CEO, it's the founder, the COO that or sometimes CTO that feels obliged to pick that up. And
Yeah.
as you say, it's not what they're trying to do. It's just something that someone has to do and they haven't got anybody else. And they're kind of hoping that, oh, if I just stick it on Amazon Web Services or whatever, then surely that's sufficient. But, sadly it's not. There's a lot more to it than that, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And the common option is like usually, spend some money with lawyers and things like that. And perhaps something to note about the business as well is like stereotypically data protection isn't like the sexiest topic. We know that. And if you look at the competitive landscape, you tend to find kind of there are like law firms or law firm-esque consultants out there who help. And a lot of the time the options can provide like quite overcomplicated solutions, like lots of legalese and jargon, and it's difficult for startups to implement the stuff that sometimes is out there. So we really want to disrupt that. We think that data protection can be simple, it can be easy, it can even be engaging, so that we can make sure employees are actually thinking about it. And we've tried to disrupt that in even like the way we deliver our brands, the way we deliver the product, the way we sell. All of that. So it's quite an important thing that we focus on as well.
Yeah, and I think it's good that you kind of called out the different pressures and different angles that can kind of come from, as you say, whether it's regulatory, customer or investor. I think sometimes with topics like this, where it's something that they have to do, or in some cases they treat it like, oh, I know I should be doing, but, I'm not doing it. I think it's all well and good kind of ignoring that until it becomes a real problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like ultimately, the most common trigger point is due diligence from prospective customers, because most of the pressure goes to the big corporates like the BPs and the Shells and the British Airways. But if you're a startup and you want to work with one of those businesses, as a result, you need to make sure you've got your ducks in a row as well. So it's usually left until the point that you've got this like 100-question due diligence questionnaire sitting on your desk, haven't got a clue how to respond to any of the questions. And then, it's like, okay, we need to do something about this now. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, when companies have had issues with the way they're managing data, obviously it might mean that they don't get the customers that they're trying to get. But, worst case scenario, it causes some real data breach of some form as well, then these days there's a lot in the press or a lot in social media. Word quickly gets out, and it's not a good thing to have to email your entire customer base saying, by the way, we're sorry, we've got a problem.
No, definitely not. And it's a good point, because I think like the reality is for startups, scale-ups, a risk of things like fines, fairly low. Like for the GDPR, there's only been a handful of fines, and they tend to go to like the BAs of the world. It's not fines. It is it's reputational risk of a breach. And if not that, then it's just making sure that you can work with big companies and partners and get investment. There is also the other aspect of it is like there's an ethical stance to take. Like some companies, some founders really care about it and want to get it right from the outset. Some don't care about it as much, and so they'll leave it, and it will be a risk that's sitting in the business. But that's a choice you have to make as a founder, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, none of the typical founders of a business will have that background and experience. So I think, it's good that you are looking to disrupt that and provide that middle ground to help, educate as well as implement.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is that I think like a lot of companies that we speak to tend to look at data protection as like a legal or a technical issue, and we try to look at it as a cultural issue as well. So it's one thing having like your policy documents in place, but ultimately it's about getting your staff to think and act in a certain way, which is particularly important as you start to scale your business up and hire lots of employees. So making sure that exactly you're embedding security and privacy into the culture of your business is ultimately what will set you up for success, versus like a one-off purchase of some policies off of a consultant.
Absolutely. And I don't think you should underestimate how much work is involved in undoing what you've ignored for the past 6 months. There could be significant kind of architectural things, within your kind of software stack and the way that you've approached that you have to kind of revert and roll back, and processes and procedures and the way that back office staff are used to working with customer data. There's potentially a lot to undo.
Huge, yeah.
Might not have cost you any more to do had you just approached it properly, earlier on in that journey. I don't know how you found that.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So we work with all types of startups and scale ups, and so there are some companies we start working with at around 200 employees, and some that we start working with 5 employees.
Right.
And the challenge of embedding data protection into the culture of the business is so much bigger when you're starting at 100, 200 employees, versus if you think about it and get it right in the early days. It has a disproportionate positive impact thinking about it and getting it right at the start. It will also probably be a lot cheaper if you get it right at the start as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I think it's definitely a real problem that startups, scale-ups, founders should be considering. So, I guess getting to kind of trust Keith as a business itself then, how and when did you get involved in Trust Keith? What stages is it at when you kind of first came across them and started to work with them?
Yeah, so the business is just over 2.5 years old. I joined 1.5 years ago when the business was about a year old. At that point, there were 4 employees.
Yeah.
The point at which I joined was when Rory, the founder, was leading on sales and marketing efforts and done an incredible job, and still does do an incredible job of founder-led sales.
Yeah.
And I think that the point that I joined was when we got, I think it's about 10 or 15 customers. We've got proof that we've got a solution that works. We're starting to get some inbound referrals, and it was about putting in place a scalable and predictable revenue system. So making sure that we've got a good marketing foundation, a good coherent sales process, a partnership strategy, all of that kind of stuff. And so that's been my focus, working very closely with the rest of the team. To get a good revenue system in place.
Cool. No, interesting. So I guess from kind of my side, that can be quite an interesting point of time, as you say, where you're starting to develop these systems. You've got an element of product market fit, so now it's that kind of go to market fit that you're looking for. So I'd love it if you could kind of explain a little bit more about some of the things as you can about that you've managed to put in place.
Yeah, sure. So probably the best way to cut it up is to look at the different channels or routes that we take to market. So I separate up our channels into 3 different areas. One is inbound, one is outbound, and then one is event and community partnerships. So on the inbound side, I think that this is ultimately at the core of our inbound strategy is a good content strategy. And if you think about like the data protection landscape for tech startups, the problem is fundamentally like a lack of know-how on what to do and when to do it for founders, because it's not their area of expertise, which means our proposition bodes well to a good educational and informative content strategy. Can we create good, simple, informative and engaging content that gives founders and scale-ups the information they need to figure out what they have to do? Can we fundamentally educate the market en masse through good content? And the result of that is then when it's the right time and people have engaged with our content, they can come to us when they're ready and say, hey, I'd like to learn more about Trust Keith. I've been using your content. At the core of the inbound marketing strategy in terms of content is live events. So we run live events once every 2 weeks. Combination of our DPOs being on those events, literally just answering questions for founders, COOs, CTOs. They'll join, they'll say like, how do I do this? And the DPO will just answer the question. There's no sales pitches, nothing like that. It's purely about helping people. And it works very well. Like it gives the end users the knowledge, the information that they need. And it gives us brand equity because they've heard of us now. We've proven some credibility, and when the time is right, they can come back to us. Naturally, by doing lots of live events, we can repurpose that content We're starting to repurpose onto YouTube. We're breaking it down into short videos, putting them onto LinkedIn posts, and all of that good stuff. And so that's one of the core components of the way we're going to market at the moment, and it works very well.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent strategy. Certainly one that we advise, kind of our clients take on board as well. And I think for the way that B2B purchases are made now, I think, the days of kind of transactional marketing, basically being an expensive way to buy somebody else's email address that you can get for free with a little bit of work, those are kind of gone. You need to build trust with the audience. You need to add genuine value, not the kind of the fake value that, yet another PDF that you're not going to read is going to be in your inbox kind of thing.
Tell me about it. I completely agree. And if you look at like the way people buy and want to buy nowadays, a lot of the time they'll be doing some form of research online, and they'll be scrolling through LinkedIn feeds, learning about things that way. They'll be chatting with people in community channels. And if you can create a good content strategy that accesses all of those channels, then I think that's going to be very effective, assuming that your target users are using all of those platforms. And I mean, most people are today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about those DPOs on those calls, genuinely not trying to sell anything, genuinely just trying to answer their questions so that you really do help somebody with something. And like you say, you're building that brand equity, you're building that trust with your audience, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, probably 80-90% of the people who come on there and we answer questions for will go away, and they might never work with us, might never come back, but that's absolutely fine. Like, we're okay with that. That's the purpose of it. And like ultimately that pays indirect dividends over the long term, because it creates this viral effect of, oh, hey, you should join this webinar, you should chat to Trust Keith. So yeah, it does. It pays returns in a slightly different way, instead of looking for a direct return every time.
Yeah, exactly. I know it's harder to measure, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. And as you say, some of the people that attend will, end up becoming customers because when the time is right, because that trust has been built. But they might just be sharing that content or telling other people about you as well that otherwise wouldn't have heard of you, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I was chatting about this. We work with like a freelance marketing director called Charlotte, who I highly recommend. We were talking about like, okay, how do we measure the success of this? And her response, which I completely agree with, was, well, inbound leads. It's all well and good looking at like the number of likes and the number of page views and like how many followers you have and things. But ultimately the data you should be looking at is, are we getting leads? Are they decent? Are they in our ICP? And if you do, then you've got proof that it's working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what constitutes a lead, like that lead quality as well, must play a part in that as well. I imagine with this, you're certainly seeing a better lead quality than you would, with some other tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's inbound. We've got two others. We've got outbound, and then I'd say community is the third one. On the outbound side, so we've broken outbound down into two kind of sub channels. You've got your traditional kind of cold outreach, building out a list, reaching out to them via email, phone, LinkedIn, all of that kind of stuff. And then a slightly like warmer type of outbound, whereby you're reaching out to people within your network and asking them to intro you to people. Something our founder, Rory, is very good at as well. We found much more success with the warm type of outbound, reaching out to people within their network, within our network. Not just asking for intros, but thinking about, okay, how can we provide value to you? I can introduce you to this person who might be able to help you, or I can refer this customer to you. And in return, would you be able to introduce me to this COO who I see you're really close with? And it actually works quite well, especially in the tech community. I feel like everyone wants to help each other. And so that strategy has worked quite well. And with this quarter in particular, we've really focused on trying to put a bit of a system in place around it, of making sure that we've got like inputs that we can aim to do each week, each month, to make sure we're doing that consistently. So that's worked well. And then on the traditional outbound stuff, we do that as well. I think that at the moment So we're about to hire an SDR who can help with some of the outbound and the referral based stuff.
Yeah.
I think that ultimately, I want to make sure that we're using a multi-channel strategy and that we're working across all of these channels. And the positive of colder outbound is that you can be incredibly targeted with who you want to reach out to,
Yeah.
and you can test the messaging that you're using. So that's been incredibly valuable from that perspective as well.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I like what you were saying about the kind of warmer approach and the way that you utilize that network, but still look to add genuine value to that network as well. And I think that, I've worked with a lot of people that are, supposed experts in LinkedIn. I've seen the results of other people that work with some of these people as well, right? And it can vary from nice to meet you, here's my pitch, to, some kind of automated approach and, making it a bit of a numbers game. And you can pick up people that way, but you end up with quite a bloated, low quality network. Whereas here, it sounds like you're describing something that's more genuine, but probably requires you to kind of understand that network a little bit more. But it is a lot more value led, certainly by the sound of it.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely takes a bit of time as well. So, like an example of one that worked recently was one of my old colleagues reached out to me and asked for some advice on their CRM evaluation. Should we use HubSpot, Salesforce, all of this kind of stuff? And we, as a business, I spoke to all of the leadership team, pulled feedback together on HubSpot and Salesforce because we've used both, documented that into a Notion page, put it into a nice structure and format, and presented it back to him. And we know that the business is a good target as well. So we're here to set a good impression. It's genuine feedback, like it's real feedback from us. And in return, would you be able to introduce us to your COO and we could have a chat about if or how we could help you with data protection? I mean, we probably put collectively about 5 or 6 hours into generating that, but actually it was worth it because value for both sides, and we managed to get a meeting out of it, which is good. Haven't had it yet, so not sure how it will go, but yeah.
No, that's really good illustration. I like what you said about making a good impression.
Yeah.
And I think not enough people think about that. They can get caught up in, sending a response, or I need to send this many messages or whatever it may be, or I'll send this over to them, I'll send them this link, I'll send them that link. But just ask yourself that question. Is it going to make a good impression? Could I make a better impression? Is it more personal?
And that, I completely agree. We want to set a good impression, and it's something that we carry throughout our entire customer journey as well. So whether you're on a first stage discovery meeting or a risk committee meeting with one of our DPOs or an account check-in, you'll after each meeting, you'll get a follow-up with a short summary of what happened in the meeting, what the next steps are, and just like little things like this to demonstrate diligence and demonstrate that we care, go a long way in setting a good impression, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it goes a long way in trust and relationship building, which obviously for a business with trust in the name is massively important. But I'd argue for any true. Business it should be, right?
I didn't think about that. Yeah, it definitely does. So that's the outbound. That's 2 of the 3, and then the third one is community. So our community strategy is about partnering up with local online communities that are communities of people within our ideal customer profile, I guess you could say. So we partner up with some venture capital firms who they kind of run Slack groups, and some kind of founder-led communities. Operations Nation is a good example, who I'd highly recommend both joining the community and partnering with them because it's absolutely epic. And so how does this work? So I'll give you the Operations Nation example because this is a good use case of one that works really well. So it's a community of operations professionals, mostly in tech startups and scale-ups, but it's a global community and it's not just limited to that. Now, they cover all aspects of operations, and there's a Slack group, there's a content channel, all of that type of stuff.
Yeah.
In terms of like the value we try to provide to the community, so we will run those events with dedicated for the community. We will answer their questions on like what they need to be knowing and thinking about data protection. If anyone ever has a question, we'll just be there to answer it.
Yeah.
Again, that's great for the community. It means people are getting questions from experts. They're getting answers that they need. And for us, again, we're getting brand equity, which is perfect. And so, yeah, partnering up with communities, helping the users of them, and providing value to the community has been really successful for us in terms of building up the brand name of Trust Key as well. It's not just Operations Nation. There are some, as mentioned, there are a couple of venture capital firms that we're doing it with as well.
Yeah.
So that's the third channel. And I think it's a really important one because, again, if you look at like how people buy today, and even if I look at how I buy, I will always check in with one of the Slack groups that I'm in. I'll say, hey, has anyone used HubSpot? Do you have any feedback on it? Before I speak to a salesperson. And so, yeah, making sure that you've got some degree of your strategy focused on communities, I think is a very important component of a modern day go-to-market strategy.
Yeah. And that's kind of mainly like trust building in those communities.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I guess that must, kind of feed back into, the product that you provide as well, right? People ask questions. It's great to be able to add value and answer those questions, but you also get good insight into, well, what type of questions are people asking at the moment as well? And how are they asking those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we pay very close attention to as well. And I mean, we've got a product manager who runs our customer interview process. It's something we do continually. But yeah, joining events and hearing what people are asking is incredibly informative in terms of like shaping our marketing messaging, our website messaging, our product strategy. Like that has an impact on everything. So it's a very good point. That's something we pay close attention to as well.
Yeah, and do you pair those kind of online communities and events with, physical ones as well? Obviously, past couple of years that's been a little tricky, but starting to come back. But do you kind of use those physical ones as well?
Yeah, we do. So we've sponsored a couple of online events, and the in-person ones are starting to come back. I'll try and attend on in-person events when I can, whether it's like with a founder community or a marketing or sales event, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But definitely, I mean, I'm a big advocate of in-person working, co-work. I'm flexible working, but I'm a big advocate of working with people in person and meeting with, people in your network and potential customers in person as well. I think there's a certain degree of value that comes from meeting someone in person that the Zoom meeting just doesn't replicate.
I think we kind of like to kind of convince ourselves, I feel sometimes that, you can have any meeting on Zoom or Teams or whatever it might be, but it isn't the same as in person. I think certain types of relationships and certain types of, work as well, like creative work, just happen better when it's face to face.
Yeah, agreed. We've got to be careful here because the working from home police might come and bash us for not being modern enough. But I think a blend of the two is ultimately my preferred option. But I am an advocate of making sure that there's some in-person contact, whether it's the way we work as a business or the way we work with customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think a balance. I think people, like to kind of go to one extreme or the other, but like many things, right, a balance of both is typically what gives the best results.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. And no, thank you firstly for kind of sharing and breaking down those three different kind of types of channels. I think that's massively interesting for me to hear, but I think massively interesting for our audience as well to get a bit of insight into. Are you doing any kind of paid media at the moment, or is that something you experimented with?
So we have we experimented with it, particularly our founder experimented with it before I was joining. We were working with this paid agency and it wasn't quite yielding results, so we stopped it.
Yeah.
And we evaluated whether it was like a channel that we were going to double down on. And at the time, we just didn't have any data to prove that it was going to work. And we had data to prove that, like, you know, the organic marketing was working. And so we decided to focus on that. So it's not at the core of what we're doing. I think that I'm no paid expert, just to from the outset, but from what I see, I think sometimes people look at paid as this one channel in isolation, but I get the impression that paid is successful when blended with a wider organic content marketing strategy. You shouldn't just be putting a paid advert on LinkedIn and trying to book a meeting. It should form part of your wider, like, educational content. So it is very likely to be something we'll start to sprinkle onto the organic content marketing, but it's not something we focus on right now.
I see. Now that's interesting, and that kind of matches my findings and the approach that we take as well. And, you know, again, have, you know, worked with all sorts of different kind of paid agencies in the past as well. And that, you know, if you try and treat it like a shortcut, like that kind of transactional marketing kind of way to, let's get in front of, you know, this content or lead magnet or whatever it is in front of as many people as possible to get as many email addresses as possible. Look, I'm counting leads. And I think the ad platforms, they kind of encourage you to do that in the way that they measure success and conversion as well. But I think if you, for me, I always see paid as like an amplifier of what you're doing on organic. So that if you've got something that works, then use that as a way to amplify what's working rather than be its own thing in isolation. Yeah,
that's a good point. Like, I think the beauty of paid is that it enables you to be uber specific on who you're targeting. And so it feels from listening to a podcast called Refine Labs, called State of Demand Gen from Refine Labs at the moment, and the way they look at it is use paid to deliver a message, not collect an email address, which I really agree with. And again, you do this stuff day in, day out, so I'd love to hear your view on it. But that really resonated with me. It's not just about trying to get an email address or book a meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100% agree. And I think, what paid is good at, if you do it right, is the ability to specify an audience and get in front of that audience. And if you think about that as, you know, one of the main things that a tool of paid media can provide, then why would you have something working on organic and then not say, well, okay, let's use that tool of paid to get that in front of some very specific people or types of people? You know, why would you say, well, okay, let's use paid, but give them something completely different and try and route them through a different path? I don't think that makes sense. But if you've got something that, you know, good content that you know would add value within an organization, then use paid to target that organization and see what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other like issue or challenge I had with paid is because I don't know much about it. It just felt like this real murky and complicated world. And I feel like if you're going to do it well, you need to have someone who really knows what they're doing and someone who's going to dedicate time and resource to it. I don't get the impression, and also have been advised by like marketing mentors who I'm in contact with, that you can't look as paid as something that you're just going to, you know, touch up every 1 or 2 weeks and on the back burner. Like, you need to focus on it and get it right. And it's like it's a continual experiment that you're working on.
Absolutely.
We don't have the expertise in our team to do that at the moment, and so just chose not to.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I certainly agree with that advice as well. And I think don't rush into trying to do pay too early. I see a lot of people trying to jump into that before they're really ready, in the same way that they're trying to overcomplicate that kind of go-to-market fit before they've really got the product market fit to start with. They might think, oh, look, I've got a little bit of interest from a few small handful of customers that you see in startups. Now let's try and scale that. Well, so no, you don't need to scale that. You actually need to focus on the experience. And, you know, if you're not getting a lot of referrals from those early customers, then that's probably the place to start before you worry about any kind of ad campaign or overly complex, you know, going on even more channels with social and organic.
Yeah, agreed. That's a good point as well. Like I speak to a lot of startup scale-ups who are looking at like how they go to market, and they think they've got this sales problem or marketing problem, and actually, if you look at it and they've got a product problem, like so. a good indicator is are your customers referring new leads to you, because that tends to be a good indication that you've got the product right. And if you have,
Yeah.
then going on to things like your marketing and sales strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, that's definitely something to focus on. If you're not getting that, then kind of ask why. And I think it all comes down to kind of the same thing really that we've been talking about, which is network and, genuine network and networking, versus number of connections you've got.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely.
Yeah. If you can add value to a networking community, then you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
No, cool. I think that's interesting to talk about kind of your perspectives on paid as well. Now kind of jumping track a little bit. I know we were kind of talking, before this call about the topics we wanted to cover. I think we've, done a really good job, hopefully, of kind of outlining some of the problems that, startup scale-ups face with data and why it's, probably not something they want to put off, and really great to hear about, that kind of marketing strategy stuff as well. But for you, kind of from a personal perspective, you mentioned that you'd come from a corporate background into a startup environment. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, some of the motivations for that and how you found it.
Yeah, of course. So perhaps a very quick bit of context. So from leaving school, didn't go to uni. I joined like a recruitment startup. That was like a four-man band. Then went to a private equity-backed SME, which had about 100 people. And then I went to a very large corporate, which had something like 20,000 people in it. So I got a bit of exposure to all three environments very intentionally.
Yeah.
I spent the majority of that time in the corporate space with a company called Thomson Reuters. And why did I join that business? So I joined to get exposure to the corporate environment, to see what it was like, and also get exposure to how to run a good enterprise sales process. And I had a great time there and learned a ton. I spent a bit of time as like an SDR. I managed the SDR team, then spent time as an AE and managed an AE team as well. I think, how does that differ to where I am today, which is like startup scale up environment? The biggest differences I noticed, which sound fairly obvious, but they are differences to talk about, is number one, access to resources. Obviously, there's a much less resource in a smaller business. And so you tend to wear more hats. The other one is the difference in brand recognition. So if you're in a sales team in Thomson Reuters and you call someone, they're probably going to have heard of you, versus if you're in an earlier stage business, you might have like a micro brand in your community, but generally people haven't heard of you. And that's a huge difference as well. And so that's brand. And the third one, I think, is like, they're just two different beasts. And I found that it's a different skill set to work in a large corporate. I found a lot of my time was spent managing internal teams and stakeholders, versus speaking with customers, which is a skill in itself, by the way. It's a very difficult thing to get right. But it's very different to working in a startup where, I've got a handful of stakeholders and most of my time is spent just going to market and trying to find customers.
Yeah.
There's probably some of the key differences that I've noticed.
Yeah, I imagine it is an incredibly different. Well, I've come from a similar journey myself. I've worked with deliberately worked with a lot of startup scale-ups, and then sought more of those bigger corporate and consultancies just to see, what were they doing that the smaller ones weren't, and vice versa. And it's different skills to kind of navigate that environment, but still lots of lessons I think you can still apply to startups and scale-ups as well.
Yeah, there definitely are. I think working in, so my assumption was going into the corporate world is that I'm going to be able to pick up a very specific playbook on like how to go to market, and then take that and reapply that in a smaller environment, which kind of worked out to a degree. I mean, in a lot of corporates, what I found also in the startup community is that there's this assumption that every large business has a perfect playbook in place, and you go in and you pick the playbook up and it's easy, you've got the brand. When actually, in reality, a lot of them haven't got good playbooks, and a lot of the startups that I speak to, and even the startup in now, might have a better playbook than what the corporate did. they tend to be a bit more disorganized than you might think. So yeah, perhaps that was definitely a difference as well.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, the other thing is just dealing with the difference in brand. And part of my job now in a smaller business is making sure that we're building up our brand continually. As we haven't got the huge name to rely on at this point. But we will.
You're obviously a lot closer to that kind of brand definition and ownership of that, and closer to how it's perceived as well, right? The feedback cycles are shorter, but as you say, you wear many hats, and that comes with a lot more responsibility, but also it's a lot easier to kind of take ownership of those results as well.
Yeah, definitely. And another difference as well is that, I mean, in the large corporate environment, I was working on much larger deal sizes and more complicated enterprise sales.
Yeah.
Which in itself comes with its own set of challenges. And you tend to find in that environment that most of your competitors are big corporates anyway.
Yeah.
So an advantage now is that going into the startup scale-up world, the sales process is a little bit more simplified. There's less time spent like worrying about InfoSec and negotiating contracts versus working in a big corporate and on enterprise sales. So that's definitely a difference too.
Yeah. No, interesting and good to kind of compare and contrast those. And as you say, I think people make assumptions about, the good and the bad and what they do and don't have sorted of those big environments as well. But I think it is just different. It's not necessarily, any better or worse, is it?
No, it's not. And I think it's worth getting a bit of exposure in both environments, or certainly that's my philosophy to it.
Yeah.
To get a real taste for what both of them are like. And there's definitely value that could be taken from both environments as well. But I think ultimately for myself, I see myself staying in the startup scale-up environment for the foreseeable future. Yeah, I think it probably just bodes better to what I enjoy and my personality.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, and yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. I think we talked to a lot of kind of diverse range of people in startups and scale-ups, and part of the reason for the podcast is to kind of highlight a lot of that kind of diversity as well, because in the tech media, there's a very kind of US investor-led kind of centric model that tends to gain a lot of coverage because it sounds really kind of sexy to say, oh well, look, we just closed this many $1 million of funding or whatever it may be, but there's a lot of different ways to build a startup, a scale, a lot of different ways to do it and run it. That said, there are some best practices that we've certainly talked about today as well, but I think there's a lot of different kind of founder backgrounds as well, and a lot of different assumptions they may or may not make about working in enterprise or selling to the enterprise as well.
Yeah, and of course it's worth noting that a very good way to learn how to sell to an enterprise is to work in one as well. Because you actually understand like how complicated and how it works. I don't think I quite appreciated the complexity of a large business until I was in one.
Right.
And it definitely helped my mindset then going to sell to other large businesses as well, because you can appreciate the number of like systems and processes that are in place, and the amount of focus there is on making sure that you've got all of the right stakeholders engaged. So definitely valid. Yeah, it's definitely worthwhile working in one if you want to learn how to sell to one.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, I can imagine with Trust Keith as well, kind of, bringing things back full circle. You mentioned, one of the pressures, could well come from those bigger companies that have those data requirements. I guess you've got to see that firsthand.
Yeah, definitely. And so when I was working in enterprise sales at Thomson Reuters, so if you'd imagine you've got an average sales cycle of 9 months, 4 or 5 months of that sales cycle would be spent it would be spent on things like data security, InfoSec, contract negotiation. Actually getting the customer to a point of agreeing that they want to go ahead with you was kind of the easy part. Like the difficult part was dealing with all of these complexities after. And so, I've got first-hand experience of how painful and annoying these data security questionnaires can be, because like they absolutely block up deals. They take time, and they're difficult to respond to, even for a large corporate. So you can imagine working in a startup, how much of a pain they can be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've worked with some clients kind of selling into some very big kind of national, multinational companies. Not that I can probably name them, but yeah, there were a lot of layers of people, and data and security came up time and time again from different angles. You'd have these spreadsheets with checklists and lots of questions and frameworks, some of which made no sense as questions to ask as well, right?
No.
That you had to try and navigate.
Yeah, and the thing is, what you find is, so I was selling, we were selling enterprise software to a big financial institution, and there were like 6 departments that we had to get through in terms of InfoSec, and every department had their own questionnaire, and all of the questionnaires had roughly the same questions on them, worded in slightly different ways, and none of the departments talked to each other. So you're starting from scratch every time. And I mean, in Thomson Reuters, we had an in-house InfoSec team to do this stuff for us. So, and it was still difficult. So doing it as like in a scale up with one legal counsel or even no one, is a real pain. Obviously the other consideration is, how risky is the solution that you're selling to these companies? Like, how much of their data are you processing? Sure. Is it just a name and email? In any case, you're still going to have to respond to the questionnaire, or are you processing their finance data, their employees' diversity data, in which case, you're going to have a tough time.
Yep, absolutely. It scales according to the type of data that you've got. Yep,
absolutely.
No, really interesting. So cool. Now, I think we've covered, quite a lot on our chat today, and I want to be respectful of your time. As well, and I think there's a lot that people can take away, certainly from this conversation. I'm sure we'll have a follow-up conversation, and I'd love to get into, some more different topics and, see how things are developed as well. But what's kind of next for Trust Keith over the coming kind of months and year or so?
What's next for Trust Keith is scaling the go-to-market plan. We've got a solution that works and that has very good feedback from our customers, and it's building that out and building out the number of companies that we can help with data protection. So that's very much the focus over the course of the next year. Hopefully we can perhaps do another podcast in a year's time, and we'll have some good developments to show. Let's see how that goes and watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to catch up and see what other lessons learned and experiences you've gained and that Trust Keith has gained as well. But just to wrap things up then, for any startup or scale up founder, COO, CTO that's in that position of someone's got to do something about data protection, but then maybe they're not quite sure where to start or what's sufficient or not. You kind of mentioned the value-led approach that you certainly take. So are there any kind of resources or things that you'd recommend they at least take a look at?
So jump onto any of our live events, ask a DPO a question. There's no sales pitching. There's no expectation that you're going to join a sales call at the end. We're literally there to help. So that's probably the best way. If you have questions on anything, you can send me or any of our DPOs a question on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. Join any of our events or drop us a note on LinkedIn, or there's resources on our website as well.
Cool, fantastic. Thank you very much. A pleasure to talk today. Thank you very much for taking the time.
No worries. Thanks, Matt. Much appreciated.
Cheers. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Inside the Scale Up. Remember, for the show notes and in-depth resources from today's guest, you can find these on the website insidethescaleup.com. You can also leave feedback on today's episode, as well as suggest guests and companies you'd like to hear from. Thank you for listening.